Now for our next speakers, Dr. Eric Wiseman, Associate Professor of Urban and Community Forestry in the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech, and Brian Keightley, Director of Fairfax County's Urban Forestry Management Division. I'm very excited about this presentation today because we get an in-depth look at specific policies in urban forestry, in this case for Fairfax County, and examine the effects of those policies on the tree canopy over time. It's a very unique presentation because we get a twofer, meaning we get two presenters here today. We get all the walk in science we want and need from a renowned professor of forestry, and all the applied practices and operations talk we want and need from a seasoned professional and leader at the municipal level. I can't wait to hear from them, and I'm so glad we got them on stage together. They would please give them a hand. Dr. Eric Wiseman and Brian Keightley.
Well, good morning, urban forestry superheroes. How are you doing today? Good to be in this awesome venue for this awesome event. I want to thank the folks who invited me to be here. Vincent, thank you for your help in helping us prepare for our presentation. So this is a presentation where Brian and I will both be talking to you. And so we're going to switch spots here in just a couple of minutes so Brian can share with you some introductory comments. But what I want to do is I want to start off by, first of all, acknowledging some of the partners that we had on this project. And so first of all, just a quick origin story about how this project came about. Mark Buscano contacted me about 2 years ago, and he said, we've had this situation now where this tree conservation ordinance has been on the books in Fairfax County for about 10 years. We have some really good tree canopy data now that was just generated in 2021. Can we investigate further what the effects have been of this tree canopy conservation ordinance? And so that set the wheels in motion, and these partners and collaborators that you see here have ultimately who have helped out in making this project possible. And at the very bottom of the screen, I want to point out my colleagues at Virginia Tech, and most notably graduate student Megan Failer. The research that you're hearing about today was the basis of her master's thesis in the Department of Forest Resources, and then Dr. J.P. Gannon was her co-advisor with me, and then Dr. Claire White from over in our civil engineering department was the third member on that advisory committee. In terms of what we're doing today or trying to accomplish with this presentation is, first of all, just showing how Fairfax County is using science to understand its policies and to inform tree canopy conservation. And so what we're going to be doing in this presentation is going through, first of all, some background on Fairfax County urban forest management and policies. That's going to be Brian's part. And then we'll move into my part, where I'll be talking about the findings of our study. And then finally, we'll conclude with Brian talking to us a little bit about the future implications of these research findings for tree canopy conservation in Fairfax County. So I'm now going to hand it over to Brian to go through some of that background for you all. The down button is how you control it. Step in.
Good morning, everybody. First off, I'd like to just go ahead and see 300 of my peers in one room in the DC area is amazing feat. So thank you, Casey Trees and Montgomery Parks, for hosting. And as a forester, I cannot deny the amount of wood that's in this room. All right. Well, Fairfax County, it's the place where I grew up, so I have a personal connection. But we are the largest jurisdiction by population in the DC region. And as I was driving over here, I was thinking about my career and where I've worked in the DC area, and I've managed to work in all three jurisdictions right here in the DMV. So a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me, Brian Keightley, I'm the Director of Urban Forestry, and I've been a licensed forester here in the state of Maryland since 2006, and an ISA certified arborist since 2007. So you may say to yourself, oh, that's an interesting combination. Yeah, so really I've brought together my career. I had no plan of being an urban forester. But as my career developed, and you take the jobs that, the opportunity as the door opens, and as your career develops, it starts to go. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I was also thinking about the traffic on the way over here. I did not stay over here. I was like, what the heck? And and that's how I got thinking about my career, and it was crossing the Wilson Bridge 20 years ago during the Wilson Bridge project. So Fairfax County's population has grown. In 1950, 189,000. In 1980, a little after I was born, 758,000. In 2000, 961,000, and in 2020, 1.15 million people. So that's an approximate 500% growth since 1950 and a 50% growth since I was born, essentially. So that is a lot of pressure being put on our urban forest. All right, so trees and development in Fairfax County. Here's a little bit of history. 1973 was when Fairfax County got our first arborist. You all can read, so I'm not gonna read these slides to you. But the important, in the 70s, between 1973 and our first replacement ordinance that was enacted in 1989, tree conservation was managed by the county. I wasn't there. I see a couple of people that may have been there. I see Mr. Knapp over here. Hello, Mr. Knapp. But from 73 to 89, essentially the county managed tree conservation through sediment erosion control policies and zoning. Okay, and in 1989, the state enacted a tree replacement ordinance. So through the development process, you were required to meet a certain percentage of tree canopy at the end of development through the replacement of trees. And in 2008, the state enacted a modification of that law, so 961.1, that allowed counties, it's a permissive law, so it's enabling legislation, I'll get into this a little bit later, that allows the county to require tree conservation through the land development process. So that's how we got there. 2016, we adopted our distribution policy for our tree planting and preservation fund. So in 2008, when we adopted 961.1, there was some language in that enabling legislation that allowed the county to establish a tree conservation fund. But it had basically for 8 years, it was very difficult to use. We had to go to our board of supervisors and actually get board action to spend the money. And in 2016, what we did is we went to the board and said, could we just get a policy that allows us to administratively distribute those funds? And so now we can do that with a panel of staff that reviews applications, and we meet the intent of that policy. That way we don't have to go back to the board every time we want to spend money on tree planting. Very useful. All right, 2020, our tree action plan was approved by the Board of Supervisors. This was written with county staff, but a lot of citizen input through our tree commission. And the big deal with this particular ordinance is that it set a no loss of tree canopy goal. But then in 2022, and we'll get into this a little bit more, the community-wide energy and conservation action plan was adopted by the county that set a specific goal. 2023, we approved the study that was done to look at tree canopy. The data that Eric's team used was actually paid for through our tree canopy fund. And then finally, just administratively, for many, many years, our forest conservation branch, which reviews plans, was in our urban forest management division, and it was administratively moved to our Department of Land Development. So CCAP. CCAP sets a goal, and you can see it here. I think I have a highlighter. Whoop. Of 60% minimum countywide, a tree canopy of 60%. And so this is at 50% in every census block. So this goal was set through a community process. This was, we engaged with the community of Fairfax County about climate change, and this was one of the outcomes. One of the things you may wonder is the emissions reduction, and that's an interesting question. I'm gonna just leave it there. Some context on land development in the county. and I have a couple more notes on this. So you can see the last 10 years we've had a lot of building permits. And when I say building permits, not all building permits result in land disturbance, right? So there are certain permits that are issued that don't require land disturbance and therefore does not require tree conservation. But the vast majority of additions, renovations, additions, new home builds, tear down rebuilds, they all require land disturbance. So you can see my back of the envelope math, 17% increase between FY23 and FY22. So a little bit of background. This, the neat thing about doing talks like this is it makes you dig into your data sets, right? And so if you're like any municipality here in the DC area, I'm gonna guess that you, tell me if I'm right here, you have a folder, right, on your shared drive. And it's got 300 folders in it, okay? And you got some names in there. Some of them say old, right? You got the old ones, or former employee, you got those. But you got this just huge, vast amount of data, and it's hard to mine. And occasions like this allow us to actually kind of take the time to dig in. And so this is actually the first time that I've compiled this list, and this is tree canopy studies that have been done basically going back to 2005 that I'm aware of. That first one here, used that Landsat 30-meter data, and you could see right away as soon as we got the resolution increase that it changed the numbers a little bit. So that's why we have the asterisk there. But if you look at this data, if you know anything about tree canopy data, it's really hard to compare different analyses. So if you were to do an analysis using a certain data set and a certain methodology, it's very hard to do straight arithmetic between the 2 years. So it would not be valid to say subtract 57 from 53. That would not be a valid analysis of this data. What we can do from this data is we can say that we see a trend. And so we're seeing a trend that, the general trend that we see from 2011 to 2021 is that we're in the low to mid 50s in tree canopy in Fairfax County. I think that's a fair statement to say. So with the Tree Planting and Preservation Fund grant, we were able to give Casey Trees money to work with Planet Geo to use some of their AI technology, machine learning technology, to do comparative tree canopy studies between 2021 and 2012. This data is comparable. Okay, now you may say, all right, the imagery resolution is different. Yes, and that's been factored into the analysis statistically. But generally speaking, it's the same data set using the same methodologies, and the analysis of that data is using the same methodology, so that you can draw a conclusion of a small canopy gain between 2012 and 2021. Now, if you think about it though, it's not outside the range between 2011 and 2012. So just things to keep in mind as we move forward with our talk. So how does Fairfax County know if development plans are meeting our 10-year tree canopy requirements? So as part of those laws that were passed in 2008 and prior to that in 2008 and 1998, within those ordinances, those enabling legislation, the county adopted what's called a 10-year tree canopy requirement. And what that is, it's a projected amount of tree canopy 10 years after development. So that's the combination of tree conservation plus tree planting. And we use some very broad math to estimate what individual trees, the amount of canopy we can get for individual trees. For example, a large canopy tree such as an oak, we estimate about 400 square feet of canopy will be gained in 10 years. So just to give you an idea. So we didn't know how to get there. Mark Boscano came to me probably around the same time he was talking to Eric and said, hey, we're thinking about doing this study with Virginia Tech. We want to look at some local ordinances. And, you know, I know we're moving in this direction of the Canopy study. Wouldn't it be cool if we were able to get a change analysis done for the period of time of our 10-year tree canopy? And I said, yes, that would be cool. That would be cool. Yes, Mark, that would be cool. So that's kind of how things kicked off. And from here, I'm going to let Eric take over.
Thank you so much, Brian, for the background. That was very helpful for getting us oriented for the scope and aim of this study and the justification of it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into looking at exactly what did we do in this study that Brian has been leading us up to this point. Ultimately, we ended up on this main research question right here. What are the patterns and trends in parcel-level tree canopy cover for properties developed since the passage of that tree canopy conservation ordinance in 2009? And so, as researchers, what we do is we sit down and we ponder that question. We unpack it, and we dig deeper into it. And so subsequently, that fundamental question led to a conceptual framework for our study that comprised a sequence of secondary questions that more or less go along with what transpires from the passage of the ordinance up to ultimately measuring the tree canopy on a given land development parcel 10 years after, in accordance to the ordinance requirements. And so you can see along the bottom here, there's this sequence of questions. First of all, the ordinance is setting the tree canopy cover requirement. Well, what exactly is that requirement for each and every parcel based on the ordinance? A second question, the tree canopy target. What is being proposed in the site plan by the developer in order to comply with that target? And then a third question from there. Once that target has been set, how do developers go about achieving that target based on some combination of preserving existing trees on the parcel and then planting new trees on that parcel during development? And then ultimately 10 years thereafter, we come back in and measure what level of tree canopy cover has been achieved, and does that comply with the requirement for canopy on that particular parcel? Okay, so Brian had mentioned the ordinance, and this is what it looks like. And you can see that it is a tiered system of increasing levels of tree canopy based on the intensity of land development. So on the low end, the requirement is 10% canopy cover on industrial, commercial, and high-density residential, and that escalates up to a maximum of 30% for low-density residential. So each and every parcel, based on its zone type, will have this requirement for tree canopy that developers are given as their target. The map on the right just shows the geographical distribution of how parcels aggregate around these requirements. And you can see that the higher density is, of course, intuitively in the northeastern portion of the county. The lower density land uses are towards the southwest. And there, as a result, there's differing requirements for developers. So as we think about our research method, something that we did was we actually went into the original site development plans. And I know you can't read this, but I'm going to step you through this. This is an extract from one of the site plans we obtained from the county. This table is showing all of the tabulations for the land area of that given parcel, and then the calculations of existing tree canopy, what the target will be, and then subsequently how that target will be addressed through preservation and planting of trees. So let me show you each one of the things here. You won't be able to read them, but this particular parcel had an existing canopy quantity of 26%. And the required canopy for this parcel, based on the ordinance, was 30%. So you can see that they are starting with a deficit. How did these particular developers aspire to meet that requirement? Well, they looked at a combination of preserving tree canopy and tree planting. In this case, this developer relied solely on tree preservation. The existing amount of tree canopy was 26%, but then they took advantage of the county's use of what is known as a tree preservation multiplier. In other words, the existing canopy, if it has certain characteristics, one of the primary ones being comprising native species, is that they will get a bonus for that. And so in this particular case, that 26% canopy cover, when multiplied by that 1.25 multiplier, resulted in 32.5% canopy. That meant that they did not have to plant additional trees in order to comply with the ordinance. Ultimately, that 32.5% from the preservation with the multiplier applied was enough to meet that requirement from the ordinance of 30%. So I'll talk more about how we use site plans for our analysis in just a moment. The other thing that we incorporated was using the GIS from the county with these parcel-level overlay on this NAPE imagery, National Agricultural Imagery Program, that is 0.6 meter, 60 centimeter resolution, and then Planet Geo did the tree canopy analysis. And so we see an example here, in this case, of a parcel. This would be one of our data points that we use in the analysis. The total land area of that parcel was 0.6 acres. Its existing canopy was the requirement, was to achieve 0.36 acres of canopy, which equates to 60% in this case. So they went above and beyond their canopy requirement of 30%. So that's how we collect our data from the remote sensing. What are some of the other data sources that we used? Well, I mentioned a moment ago the GIS parcel data. We also combined with that the tree canopy data from the same year, 2021, and then we compiled some of the site plans from the time frame of 2009 to 2011. Recall that that is the time frame in which the ordinance was enacted in 2009, and then 2011 would have been the year that would have started the 10-year clock for canopy requirement for the 2021 analysis of the canopy from Planet Geo. So you can see there ends up being 3 data sets that we worked with. First of all, the overall study population, that was all parcels that were developed between 2009 and 2011, comprising 7,162 parcels. We then subsetted that to focus in specifically on those parcels that the 10-year time frame had elapsed, which is the requirement of the ordinance. That brings it down to a number of parcels of 482. We then took a sample of those particular parcels to do a more intensive analysis of the site plans. So that table that I showed you a moment ago, where we're going in and we're finding out what was required and what was proposed as the target. And then that brings it down. This sample was within our capacity was to evaluate 151 site plans that were sampled from that subpopulation. Okay, so the first bit of data here. So the first research question that we were striving to answer from the analysis was this: what percentage of parcels met their tree canopy requirements? The data set that we used for this was all land parcels developed from 2009 to 2011. Hence, their 10-year time frame had elapsed. Remember that this comprises 482 parcels. So let's take a look at some data now, and I'm going to take a moment to explain what you're looking at. First of all, this map is showing the parcels and whether or not they complied. And so the purple dots are those that did not comply. The green dots are those that did comply. Just giving you a sense for the geographic distribution of the parcels that we evaluated and how they fall out with complying or not. So we have a bar chart here. Let me help you get oriented. On the horizontal axis is the number of parcels. So remember that in total that will be 482, but we broke this down across different zone types. So you can see we have residential, planned units, industrial, and commercial, and the majority of the parcels in our analysis were in the residential land use. That is primarily the type of data that we were looking at here. But what I want to point out to you here is that we're seeing a high degree of compliance with the ordinance, meaning that these parcels are meeting whatever their particular 10-year requirement was based on the ordinance. And you can see that by the magnitude of the green bar relative to the purple bar for any given land use or zone type. So overall, what we observed was that the compliance came in on average at about 80% for all of these 4 zoning types. And built into this analysis was also a question of was there any differences associated with zoning type with compliance? In other words, did they differ? In this particular case, the p-value of that statistical test was 0.065, which means that there was marginal significance or some evidence that there were differences in compliance depending on the zone type. More will come on that in a little bit. Okay, now we have a second research question that we were aiming to answer. This question was, what percentage of parcels meet their tree canopy requirements? We were using the same data set here, that 482 parcels developed between 2009. Excuse me, I misread my question here. How much did the measured canopy differ from required canopy on the parcels? And so in this case, we're using the same data set. And then we're looking at the data in a slightly different way. So now instead of just looking yes, no compliance, we're actually looking at the difference between what was required for canopy and what was measured. So how are the data being presented to you here? These are box plots. Box plots show the distribution of data as well as the central tendency. And of course, what we care about with the central tendency is the mean. The mean that's being measured here is the difference between what was measured and what was required. The red line indicates 0, so meaning that there would be no difference between measured and required. And you'll notice that all of the means, as indicated by the diamond shape in the middle of the green box, is showing that we had a positive difference between measured and required. So on average, each of these zoning types were meeting the requirement. Specifically, let's look at the average differences broken down by zone type. Within the residential land use, that average difference was about 16%, and it was statistically significantly different from 0. So on average, yes, parcels did have a net greater amount than required. And then looking at the planned units, that difference was down slightly. It was not a significantly statistical difference, but that's primarily because of the dispersion in the data. You can see that there's a lot of spread in that box plot that we're looking at there. And then looking at the industrial land use and the commercial, we had a very small sample size to work with, 3 parcels and 4 parcels respectively. And so we just didn't have the statistical power to really say with any certainty that that difference between measured and required was real. The overall average difference for all of these 4 land use types was about 16%, meaning that what was measured was 16% canopy greater than what was required by the ordinance. And we did not, in this particular case, find a statistically significant difference across the zoning types, meaning that there was not evidence that they differed in how much more the canopy that they achieved than the requirement. Okay, let's move on to another research question. The next research question was, did the development plan type influence the canopy requirement? And the data set that we used to answer that question is, again, that 482 parcel set of parcels that were developed between 2009 and 2011. So here's our chart that we're going to look at. It's another example of using the box plots. On the horizontal axis is going to be the difference between measured and required tree canopy. Again, we have that red vertical line that denotes the 0 difference point. And then we can see on the vertical axis the plan types. And so this is part of the land development approval process. Depending on what is being proposed, a different type of plan will be submitted. And so 3 types that we were looking at here: a subdivision plan, a site plan, and then an infill plan. And what you will see is that the number of infill plans was much greater than the subdivision plans and site plans. But in looking at how these particular site plans differed, achieved differences between required and measured, we see that on average it was a positive number. So bring these up here. For the subdivision plans, the average difference was a net of 7.9% canopy. It was a very small sample size. It was a sample size of 1, so there was no ability to statistically evaluate that difference from 0. I guess we can say it is greater than, because we only had 1 to look at. In terms of the site plans, we found that the average difference was about 17.6%. This was not a statistically significant difference from zero, so we can't infer that on average they're actually greater than zero in that case. And then with the infill site plans, where we had 440 of those, the average difference was about 15.7%, and this was a statistically significant difference from zero. So in all three cases, again, more canopy is being achieved after 10 years than was required by the ordinance. And then I'll just point out here that when we looked at was there a difference between plan types in this difference in canopy, we were not able to detect a statistically significant difference, but that's primarily because of some of the irregularities in the sample size. So given those irregularities, what we did was we then focused on looking at just the infill lot plans, looking specifically at those. And now we're trying to answer this research question. What differences were there between parcels that did and did not meet their requirements? So remember a few slides ago, we saw the breakdown, and on average, about 80% of parcels are meeting the requirement. For those that did and did not, that 80 and 20 split, what is different about those particular parcels? So I'm going to show you some tabular data now. Let me explain to you what we're looking at and what to focus on. The parcel attribute on the left are what we judge to be some key characteristics that might be important for understanding why the compliers and the non-compliers differ. So you can see here we have the parcel size, the acreage of the individual parcels, the percentage of the parcel covered by impervious surfaces, and then three metrics of canopy. What was required, what was measured, and what was the difference between those. And I have placed in the box here two statistics to pay attention to. First of all is the mean or average for each of these parcel attributes, and then finally the p-value that's comparing for any particular attribute, is there a difference between the compliers and the non-compliers? And so this is how that shakes out. Parcels not meeting the requirements were different from those that met their requirements in this way. First of all, those parcels tended to be smaller. They tended to be more intensively developed. They had slightly smaller canopy requirements, which is kind of counterintuitive, but we know that they weren't playing at a disadvantage, so to speak. And then likewise, ultimately, they had much less measured canopy. And so if you look at the yellow box there at the bottom, those that did not meet the requirement, on average, they were coming in about 10% lower than necessary, whereas those that were complying were coming in at about 22% above what was required. Okay. Our next research question was, did residential zone code have any influence on meeting canopy requirements? And for this particular research question, we were looking at the infill parcels again, but specifically looking at taking a sample of site plans from the residential land use. So let's take a look at this data. Let me help you get oriented. Horizontal axis are the number of parcels in the sample. The vertical axis is the zoning code, and you can see that it's oriented from relatively low density, towards the bottom here are the R1s through the R4s that have increasing levels of density, and then the RC and the RE at the top stand for residential conservation and residential estate, so being fairly low density development. But what we're seeing here is, again, pretty high level of compliance across the board, on average, about 82% compliance. And then looking at the zone code effect, in other words, does the residential zoning matter? In this case, we could not detect a statistically significant difference, meaning that more or less all of these zoning codes are complying in a similar fashion. And so another interesting piece of data to complement this with is to look at how much existing tree canopy was on the parcel. So I mentioned earlier, were the non-compliers starting out at a disadvantage perhaps because they were required to have more canopy? We said no, we answered that question. Here we're answering the question, well, were they starting out at a disadvantage because they had less canopy right from the get-go? And the answer here is maybe, in that the parcels that did comply tended to start out with more canopy. So you can see on the right there, the compliant parcels tended to start with about, on average, 50% tree canopy, whereas those that ended up not complying started out with about 33%. Now, this could be pretty heavily confounded by a lot of different things that relate to the zone code, for example, or the parcel size. It's complicated, and this is at least giving us a little more insight into what they were starting with and what the expectation was and how that affected their ability to comply with the ordinance. Okay. So another research question that we aimed to answer was, did residential zone code have any influence on meeting canopy requirements? Again, going to the sample of infill residential site plans. And here what we're looking at, as we saw earlier, is based on the zone code, what was the difference between the requirement and what was achieved or measured? And so we have that vertical orientating line, the red line there at 0, and then focus on the means, the diamonds in the center of each box plot. And here are the average differences based on those residential zone codes. It ranges anywhere from a low of 9.8% to a high of about 37%. And you can see that in almost every case, except for the small sample sizes, these were real statistically significant differences. I'll also point out the highlighted values here. These are statistical tests that are evaluating whether or not any of the average differences were different amongst the residential zone codes. And so what we're seeing here is that the RC, the Residential Conservation Zone Code, did achieve a statistically higher difference after 10 years of canopy development than the other types of residential zoning. Another research question we asked was, are developers hitting their target for proposed tree canopy? In this case, we used that same data set again, so this would be the sample of 151 residential infill parcels, and the tabular data that we're looking here is very similar to what we saw earlier, where you have the parcel attributes on the left, and then we have highlighted 2 statistical columns that are relevant here: the mean or average for that particular parcel attribute, and then the p-value evaluating whether or not that particular parcel statistically differed between those parcels that did and did not comply with the zoning requirement. And so the messages that we take from these statistical tests and data are this: comparing those parcels that do and do not comply, we see that the tree canopy requirements were similar. So that means that they were, again, had similar expectations for what they were going to achieve. Their proposed canopy targets typically exceeded the requirements for both. So in other words, the developers were proposing something that went above and beyond the requirement through tree preservation and tree planting. And then when we look at the differences between measured and proposed canopy, and ultimately the canopy difference between what was required and measured, we see these things. Those parcels that do not comply tend to really underachieve. So you can see there that about 10% canopy deficit on average after the 10 to 11 years. But the compliers tend to overachieve, and so therefore they may be possibly offsetting the non-compliers. It all depends, of course, on how much acreage of canopy we're talking about. We're looking at values that are measurements of percentages, so we'd have to take that into consideration as well. Okay, so that concludes the portion of presenting the research data. Brian's going to come up now and talk to us a little bit about the research implications and some possible paths for future work.
Thank you, Eric. You know, as someone who's implementing policy, you know, at the municipal level, you know, we look at things a little bit differently than the academics. But I think driving our policy by data is critical. We can't make good decisions unless we know the space that we're working in. So I think, I keep pressing the wrong button. All right, there we go. All right, so some of the things I would take away is that generally speaking, tree conservation through the development process makes a significant difference. You know, we're going to keep the genetic component of the existing forest in that area. We're going to set ourselves up for the next generation. From what we've seen, not so much from Eric's study, but from the overall study that we did on the county's tree canopy, you know, what we saw was that significant growth comes from existing trees. And if you think about it, it's really hard to see tree growth on a temporal scale as a human being, but if you ever do time-lapse photos of a particular tree, you can see how much canopy existing trees can put on. And then just generally speaking, you know, the county, our forestry program is embedded within our stormwater management program. And so this is the type of data that we need to kind of not only justify that placement in county government, but what are the benefits to the county's overall, you know, streams and water quality. And you know, through the development process, tree preservation is going to give us the most benefit to preserving that water quality. All right, we're going to talk about an old guy. All right, John Dillon. Real quick, just to give some implications of what we can do. We want to change policy in Virginia. Virginia is a Dillon rule state. Here in Maryland, you are a home rule state. So in Virginia, across the river, that takes forever to drive from, we have to ask permission from the General Assembly, essentially. We have to get permission to be more restrictive than state law. And this all goes back to John Dillon, and essentially what I understand from reading some you know, overall presentations from the William and Mary Law School is that the Dillon rule is essentially considered jurisprudence in Virginia. There's been a couple challenges to that over the years that have failed, so that's just kind of the reality of where we are right now. So what policies can the county board change if we're in the situation of Mother May I? So a lot of the policy changes that the county board can do is kind of within their existing authority. So if you look at the state law, you know, it's like any state law, there's room for interpretation. And so the administrative law that we have in Fairfax County through our public facilities manual, which essentially drives like the criteria for your development, that's where we can make a lot of difference without going back to the state. So here's some examples of where we can make some changes. I think some of the areas that we're going to lean into after Eric's study and the overall tree canopy study is the effectiveness of tree planting and the tree canopy credits we're giving. Like I said, a oak tree, we currently give 10-year tree canopy of 200 square feet. Is that too much, too less? That's one of the things we're going to start to lean in on. But from the state level, I think that's, you know, and I know that there are some tree advocates in the room. So, you know, just some of the things that to consider is, in my opinion, you know, state politics in Virginia is a multi-year game of chess. And what we found over the years is that many tree advocates, very well intended, go to Richmond and the General Assembly and play a single year game of checkers. Okay, you need to know the moves in Virginia of the implications of not only the legislation that you're working on, but all of the political implications of different areas of the state. What I can say and what I've heard in Richmond is these laws are often referred to as the Fairfax laws or the Northern Virginia laws. They are not implemented in the rest of the state. So for us to convince the General Assembly to give us more authority takes a little bit of coaxing, and it takes a little bit of planning. My understanding, and Mr. Knapp, who's in the room, who was the previous director of Fairfax County Urban Forestry, spent about 6 years playing chess at the General Assembly to get the original conservation ordinance passed. So just some examples of what could theoretically be changed, areas to focus on. I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to throw out my suggestions in the policy realm, but these are the areas of focus that I would encourage any tree advocate to look at. I think these are the areas that have the most opportunity. All right. I just wanted to touch on this. Many of you are probably aware that COG released its regional tree canopy goals. So we used the overall tree canopy study, the 2021 data for the whole county. And through some quick analysis, I looked at the COG goals have a slightly different classification. You can't line them up perfectly. But generally speaking, Fairfax County is in good ranges. But areas of focus, commercial, obviously, and then medium density residential. Now this is an area that I think the county can make a difference in through tree planting. Okay, so my hypothesis is much of the county developed in the 50s and the 60s, trees are hitting 50, 60 years old, and trees are coming down either due to mortality or voluntary removal. So this is an area where the county can lean in and encourage and incentivize tree planting on, and when I say medium density residential, think like quarter-acre lots, which makes up the vast majority of Fairfax County's residential properties. Okay, on these slides, I'd like to thank someone in the audience. Raise your hand, Brett Leslie. Brett, thank you very much. Brett actually developed these slides on my behalf, or actually on the behalf of the Tree Commission, and I asked him if I could use it. So this is something we're dealing with. So we went over the county's overall tree canopy goal. Canopy met. And I'm gonna kind of try to step over here, but you can see from the chart over here, you can see tree canopy. Let me grab the microphone. Sorry, folks. So canopy met. So we're looking at this census block. So can we meet 60% tree canopy and 40% in every census block by 30 and 50% by 2050? So if we take the existing tree canopy, 31 plus 21, we get to 52. So we can meet in this census block the tree canopy requirement. But let's move on to another example. Now this is over along the Silver Line, I believe in the Reston area. And this census block is significantly more impervious. Look at that, 91%. Wow, what are we gonna do there? So no matter what we do, 2 plus 4 will never equal any of these numbers. So this is a challenge, right? So when CCAP was approved by the Fairfax County Board, it was very well intended, but we did not have any data to base things on at the time. We did not have this data. So this is the kind of information we're going to get back to our Board of Supervisors to adjust policy. Now, can we plant our way out of this? That is the question. Okay, so you saw the 60% tree canopy goal in the county. We're currently at 55% as of the 2021 Planet Geo study. So just think about these numbers. Okay. Using 300 trees per acre to reach the county's canopy goal of 60% would require 12,579 acres to be planted. 12,579 acres. Okay, or about 3.8 million trees. Okay? So are we going to plant our way out of this? I'm going to let you come to your own conclusion on that. But I think it just emphasizes tree conservation again. So we're going to put another feather in our cap for tree conservation, and that's what you should take away from this. But what can we do? Okay. So on this map, this is a dated map. It doesn't show our most current data. I need to get this updated with our GIS department. But we take tree canopy. The darker the color, the lower the tree canopy. So don't get confused here. We had to do an analysis. And then on the right, you'll see the county's vulnerability index. And what we're showing here is in areas of low tree canopy and high social vulnerability, those are areas of focus. So we're going to take a common sense approach here, and we're going to try to encourage and incentivize planting in areas of lower tree canopy, social vulnerability, heat islands, and reduce those daytime temperatures. And then, again, like I mentioned before, that medium density residential area, I think, is an area that the county can focus getting more trees on. So the presentation takeaways, I think this is me. So what it comes down to, folks, is tree conservation is the most effective tool. All right, we're not going to meet these tree canopy goals through tree planting, in case you didn't come to that conclusion. All right, there is room for improvement, but the current tree conservation ordinance in Virginia works quite well. It's around the margins, and we're going to focus on that. We're going to use this data to focus on where we can improve that. Obviously, tree canopy growth is incremental, and the scale of planting is substantial. And yeah, you know, Eric, I think I had plans, and Eric said hopes, so you can see where the academic researcher and the funder are at. But I plan to work with Virginia Tech to refine these research methodologies and to continue to do some analysis on this data. And then obviously, and this is the message I think everyone should take away, is that we need to base policy on data, okay? And at the time, whatever the best available data you have, use it, okay? Strive to get better data. And with that, I'm going to give my thanks. Thank you for listening, and thank you to Dr. Wiseman for coming up from Blacksburg. Yep. Eric?
Thank you, Brian and Eric. Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So again, if you will raise your hand, we'll have somebody come by. Alex and Lucy are grabbing the microphones, but maybe I can just start us off the question. Throughout this process, what was maybe one of your biggest surprises that you had when looking at data and looking at the effectiveness of this ordinance?
Yeah, so the question was surprises. It's like an onion. You peel it back and peel it back and peel it back, and we had a hard time staying focused, not having mission creep on our research questions, because each time we delved into a research question, it led to new questions. And ultimately we realized this is an important analysis, but it is admittedly a very superficial analysis initially, and there's lots of peculiarities about the results that we don't completely understand why they are the way that they are, and we need to dig deeper. I'll let Brian comment on his surprises.
I think I was surprised at both how well Fairfax County keeps its records and just astronomical amount of data we had. I mean, digging into the approved land use plans in the county was just amazing. So that's what surprised me. We were able to pull it off. At the front end of this, it looked like a mountain that would be difficult to climb, and I commend Megan Failer in her work.
Got a question over here?
Hey everyone, as a GIS nerd and forestry professional, this is my kind of presentation. So I have two quick questions, an easy one for Eric and a hard one for Brian, because I have to do that. Is there a model that other jurisdictions could plug their data into to simulate this if we massage our data to meet the requirements a little bit? And for Brian, do you see, obviously 20% doesn't meet 40%, do you anticipate these parcels to reach that 40 and 60% goal in Fairfax County, and do you have an anticipation on how long that would take to get there?
All right, I'll answer the supposedly easy question. Could other jurisdictions or other organizations replicate this? The reality is, although we used GIS to compile the data, we weren't actually doing GIS analysis. Essentially, we were just working with the attribute table in the GIS, appending to the parcel level data and those attributes a column of measured tree canopy in 2021 based on the Planet Geo. So it was really Megan just doing a lot of Excel analysis and running some R code for statistical tests. Whether or not that, I guess maybe that is an optimistic thing in that it's perhaps not inaccessible if you don't have GIS expertise, but someone will have to bring to this probably their own form or fashion of Excel analysis and R analysis to do some standard calculations, and would be happy to talk with people about that if they have interest.
Thanks, Vincent. So yeah, the question was, given that 20% gap, do we anticipate? How would we anticipate closing that 20% gap on plans? And I think some of the areas we're looking on is obviously the tree preservation targets. That's an obvious one. By zoning, and using that data to make sure that we hone in on the right zoning classification, and main, commercial, industrial. Obviously is a lot lower than the residential canopy rates, so that would be important. Now, whether we can meet it, I think we can gain, I don't know if I had to guesstimate, probably, on the margins 5 to 10% off of existing canopy, and then we'd have to plant. So then we're gonna be into this 3 million tree question. So can we get there? I think anything's possible. But what we do, we need to be focused, okay? We can't be focused on the areas that is not gonna gain us significant canopy growth. I know that's a kind of an ambiguous answer, but I think that's where we're at.
All right, we have a question over here.
Yeah, excellent presentation, really intriguing. This is a question for Brian. I'm wondering if you've thought about or whether you have kind of a backstop for individual project development. It seems like if you're in a zone that has a 30% canopy requirement and you have 50% coverage to begin with, you could have a reduction of 40% of the coverage that's there, and it would be like no harm, no foul. This is in compliance. So do you need to have some kind of a backstop that requires replacement for net loss of canopy?
We don't currently, and I would say that you have identified an issue there. What I will say is we've seen on the large, so tree conservation is important on both small and large lots, and how they're handled is differently, right? So you can meet almost, the majority of your tree conservation on a infill quarter-acre lot through tree preservation, and especially if we start to add canopy multipliers, it can be done. When you get to the larger lot, you're kind of at an advantage. You have a surplus of canopy, we're gonna be impacting it. What we need to focus on is essentially that issue. And through the rezoning process, that's something that doesn't often get discussed, but when a parcel is rezoned, the tree canopy requirement changes. So if it was a residential property and it gets rezoned as commercial, right off the bat, you lose 15, 20% of tree canopy requirement. So those are some of the areas that we're focused on.
Question over here.
We have time for 2 more questions. So this question here. I will remind you that we're going to try and take a coffee break after this, and everyone's available for questions. You can talk to Brian and Eric and Leslie during the coffee break and all throughout today. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you both so much. Question for you, Brian. Could you share with us how you enforce, what are some of your enforcement mechanisms here? And then on the more positive side, how you support parcel owners in meeting these requirements?
Enforce the tree conservation requirement? So through the land development process, basically when you enter into that permitting process, you essentially give the right to the county to come out to your site and review it. So we are one of the larger urban forestry programs. As I mentioned in one of the first slides, our forest conservation branch, which was formerly under me, is now in our land development services. So we were a unified group of 25, and now we've split into 11 and 13, including 14, I guess, including me, that remain. So the folks that are working in our land development services group are working with essentially erosion site control inspectors. We have a lot of those, and basically they're the eyes on the ground. Obviously the urban foresters try to get to every site, but For those in the room that do land development, you know it's hard to do. So we rely a lot on the erosion sediment control inspectors. Now, promoting tree conservation, that's probably what I typically tell people is, yes, there's the ordinance, there is the practicality of putting together a tree preservation plan. You want it done by an arborist, yada, 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 right? We all know this. But what it comes down to, and where we see a lot of gains in Canopy through the development process, is that conversation and relationship between the review forester and the developer. And a lot can be gained in that. And when you're talking, we're talking about Canopy on the margin. So if we're talking 5%, 10%, that's a lot. So I would encourage you. A lot of people get upset about land development, and I hear you. No one likes to see trees come down, but having that relationship with not only the developers but the engineers that are preparing the plans and working in those margins to gain as much canopy as possible.
All right, we have our last question here.
Hi, I work for Baltimore County, and we also have a program to plant trees in lower socioeconomic areas. And our biggest issue with community buy-in is when there's like a responsibility for homeowners to have to like replace sidewalks or pipes or that kind of thing, especially if they're already in like a lower economic area. And so I'm wondering, for Fairfax County, what is the responsibility for your residents when you're planting county trees related to like replacing broken pipes and sidewalks? Like, how do you deal with community members who don't want trees for these kinds of reasons?
Well, I hate to give that, so I'm going to give the easy, quick answer, which is Fairfax County doesn't own the majority of street trees in the county. So going back to the Byrd Act in 1936, counties took over the vast majority. Arlington is an exception. Have taken over maintenance of the right-of-way. So we don't have a lot of those encounters. But from other professional experience, I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is no one likes things forced on them, especially by the government. So what I would encourage folks to do, and I've done this at a couple of Casey Trees events over the years where I've had the privilege to speak a little bit, is raise your hand if you are a nonprofit working in the world of urban forestry. Raise your hand. Locally, you're a nonprofit working. Okay. Now raise your hand if you're a municipal arborist or forester. Raise your hand. All right, y'all need to meet, okay? Because that's how you can get buy-in from the community, is working through nonprofits, is my personal opinion.
Thank you, Brian and Eric. Can we give them a big hand, please?